Every year, around 6 to 8 million tons of oyster shells are dumped into the ocean. And this volume naturally puts serious pressure on marine ecology. Before the shells end up in the water, they pile up on the streets of towns and villages that do aqua farming. They just lay around everywhere, serving no purpose. And naturally, these piles cause environmental issues. Strong fish yodoran create breeding grounds for mosquitoes. In other words, they stink like crazy and breed insects. The problem with shells is that they don't break down like of other fish. Waste, you also can't compost them. So if you dump oyster shells somewhere, they'll just stay there for a very long time. In fact, over time, the pile might even grow. Someone else might think it's an oyster dump and throw in more shells. For example, it seems like in the Taiwanese village of Wangong, every third house has baskets filled with empty shells. These shells are just everywhere. It's estimated that every year 10 million tons of oyster clams, colopan mussel shells are produced on our planet. Whether these shells are sent to the sea or to landfill, they see also problems. And finding a decent disposal method that doesn't harm nature is a real challenge. What they've come up with in Taiwan is truly impressive. It's a great example for anyone looking to help the environment in an effective and economically viable. First, let's go over the basics. For more than 300 years, they've been farming oysters in Taiwan. And in these 3 centuries, the process has barely changed. But harrison isn't tradition. It's because the soil on the island has a high salt concentration, making farming impossible. Instead, it's excellent for oyster cultivation, thanks to the farmers' efforts. The mollusks have become the primary source of income for others. So oysters have become one of the most famous delicacies in Taiwan. According to data from 2015, 500,000 fishermen and industry workers were farming and processing fish, shellfish, and mollusks on 100,000 acres, which is about the size of 150,000. 00 Olympic swimming pools. It's a huge operation. Because demand creates supply. Only in Taiwan, they consume about 200 tons of shellfish a year, and in all kinds of forms, to avoid disappointing consumers. Oyster beds were expanded to unbelievable sizes. For example, the town of Fuan produces about 35,000 tons of oysters per year from 11 miles of oyster beds in the tidal zone during low tide. These oyster beds stretch almost to the horizon. They carry a lot of oyster shear. It's just like that scene from Attack of the Clones. And then I started to wonder, how exactly can you grow oysters? It turns out there are actually 3 different methods. The first method uses rafts that are held up by large styrofoam buoys. You could say the oysters are floating on foam. This farm looks like a patchwork of still waters off the bay with green mesh nets, and a small wooden canoe for transporting the catch oysters are grown on floating bamboo rafts to which empty oyster shells are tied. They serve as a substrate for the larvae to grow in this system. The growth of oysters doesn't depend on the water depth. Although this method is used in areas with deeper water, must be a coincidence. The second method is bamboo sticks, which are loosely tied together and driven into the soft sea bottom. You can often see these oyster racks in the inner sea orbital streams because this method works for you. In areas where the water level stays between roughly 1 ft and a bit more than 3 ft during low tide. And finally, the third method, the string method. Here, ropes are attached and hung from a support, creating something like fences on which they often hang empty oyster shells. They're ideal for serving as a platform for young oysters to attach and grow. To make this happen, farmers sundy larger oyster shells and drill holes in them. 10 shells are then hung on an nylon string, and each shell can host many small oysters. Growing strings, this is usually done in shallow. Later, when the water level changes, most oysters end up on the water surface to soak up some sunlight. So basically, growing oysters is like a super strange form of fish gardening, but just like on any farm, animals help people here. And when it comes to growing oysters, it's the ocean oxen. This isn't some weird creature, but just ordinary oxen that received training in the coastal village of Fenua. Once the count of ocean oxen went up to 400, but recently the number of these helpers has been dropping. Nowadays, there are around 8 of them, but each is an expert in their job. Not that the work was all that tough, really. These oxen are trained to go into the ocean, wait until the oyster farmers load their catch, and then the oxen carry the oyster home. But it's important to consider that oxen are big and quite clumsy creatures, which, however, remember the route from their home to the oyster field. These harvesters don't need to tell the oxen where to go, and once there, the animals are careful. Achieving such behavior usually takes years of training. It's now under that most harvesters today use machines. They're simply more efficient and don't need to be trained. So what do I have in the end? An overall picture. And the fact that some old oyster shells are being used by farmers to grow new oysters, unfortunately, that's still not enough. And their remaining shells still need to be properly disposed of. Some of them are ground into powder at factories, which is used in making household items like incense sticks. It turns out that ground shells help reduce smoke and toxic chemicals released when burning incense. This is because oyster shells are materials with low thermal conductivity. They don't absorb or disperse heat. I hope it doesn't add a fishy smell to the incense. More recent research has revealed there are numerous areas where oyster shells are used. These include water purification, additives and building materials, elements of landscape design, and even adjusting soil pH. They can even be used as fertilizer. It turns out that ground shells contain a small amount of nitrogen, so they can be good for plants. Even all these methods of disposal aren't enough. The problem is too serious, and no amount of incense, along with landscaping, can solve it. We need something better. And then Eddie Wong stepped in to help humanity. Growing up on Taiwan's west coast, where shellfish farming is common, he saw who discarded oyster shells turned from waste into useful material. The people in his coastal town used these discarded oyster shells as insulation for their homes. The homes were warm in the winter and cool in the summers. Such an unexpected oyster effect. Meanwhile, Wong ran a company called Creative Tech Textile, which made eco-fabric, a polyester material made from recycled plastic bottles. But it wasn't happy with the texture and was looking for other options, and he found them trying to understand the unique properties of oyster shells. Eddie Wong became the person who invented and patented the idea of making fabric from these shells to get to this genuinely brilliant development. He started working with a research institute, experimenting, and in 2013 came up with the right formula. He made a material similar to wool from oyster shells. Today, Eddie Wong's factory in Taiwan uses about 100 tons of oyster shells a year to produce about 900 tons of seawool, a fabric that's patented and trademarked clothes made from it, bringing around $6.1 million a year. But all this activity would be impossible without the unique oyster farming culture on the island. There's no place in the world with conditions as perfect for this type of production. As Taiwan, what does this process look like before the shells make it to the factories? Farmers collect the thiolis from racks set up along the coastline. You remember all those growing methods. The gathered oysters are sorted into baskets and sent to the factories, where the harvest is carefully washed with a special machine. Clean shells are sent to small family businesses, which clean them of meat. And of course, they use that too. As I mentioned, oysters are very popular in Taiwan, while the clean shells are sent back to the factory, where they're ground down into nanoparticles and then mixed with yarn made from recycled plastic bottles. The resulting threads are used to make fabric that's not just the fabric of the future, but also an eco-friendly, low-carbon product. Just think about it. It's made from shells that capture and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the process doesn't use any water. It's like an environmentalist's dream come true. This is great news for consumers too. The oyster shell powder is created through a high heat process that imparts antibacterial and deodorizing qualities to the fabric's result. What was once argular, somewhat uncomfortable recycled plastic fabric has now been enhanced with these valuable properties. For example, oyster shell powder biocalcium oxide has high moisture absorption and low thermal conductivity. Moisture is retained, which helps prevent heat loss. Has super bit of chemistry coming up. So an oyster shell contains 80% calcium carbonate and 20% light metal elements. Meanwhile, the raw materials has many micropores on a large surface area. Thus, biocalcium oxide can easily absorb moisture to have free ions for increased conductivity. If you didn't get it now, worries. The main thing is that this fabric is good. They even suggest using it for making baby strollers. No chemicals, just pure ecology. Neat. While one country is working on the fabric of the future, the Coastal Waters Protection Association is dumping 40 tons of recycled oyster shells into Turtle Bay, Florida. These empty shells are an issue not just for Taiwan, but in other countries. It's on a smaller scale. All these 44 tons of shells came from one restaurant, waited their turn during a 6-month quarantine, and then were dumped into the water, all for the sake of the environment. The idea is that if you dump clean oyster shells, larvae can attach to the mangrove. This in turn will create new oyster reefs, because more than 85% of oyster reefs worldwide have been destroyed in Australia. They've also come up with a way to deal with shells thrown out by restaurants. Basically, the idea is the same: collect shells from restaurants. Ants clean them thoroughly and then drop them into Moran Bay, so an oyster reef growth. Their oyster reefs, like coral reefs, are structures where marine plants and animals can live. In short, they're an important part of the coastal landscape, and for several years. Now, the Ozfish organization, a nonprofit dedicated to recreational fishing, has been working on restoring them in Australia, in Louisiana. At the rare, even higher hopes placed on oyster shells, they're thought to help guard the coastline against erosion in the past 100 years over 190. 0 square miles of Louisiana and a shoreline have been lost, but if we create an oyster reefing empty shells, it should definitely make a difference in New York. Meanwhile, they're hoping that an oyster reef will save the city during the next big storm. That is about 2,600 feet of breakwater should do the trick, but strategically covered with cleaned oyster shells. As the oyster reefs grow, people are counting on them to help control flooding and coastal erosion, while also providing a new habitat for various marine life. Naturally, in each of these cases, oyster shells undergo process. In Gandare, quarantined for instance, they might be left out in the sun for up to a year to ensure that decaying flesh and bacteria are completely eliminated. Otherwise, you might accidentally create a huge hazardous graveyard instead of a reef cooling with shells. So if you're watching this video from planet Earth, you don't need to mention that it's been getting hotter recently. Europeans in particular are noticing this and trying to find ways to cool their homes' air conditioners help, but they also impact the climate even more, so see. Italy, there's been an alternative painting roofs white only used for this purpose, not regular paint, but a blend of powdered oyster shells in. France, over 130,000 tons of oyster shells are discarded each year because they also really love eating oysters. There are some studies show that adding these crushed shells to paint makes it more durable, all thanks to calciums, so why not use it? A oyster-enriched heat-reflective roofing paint is applied in 3 layers, the first 2 for durability, and the third to reflect 90% of the sunlight. As part of the experiment, they even painted a couple of houses, and it turned out that the temperature inside was 50 degrees Fahrenheit lower than in the houses. That weren't painted shoes for Little Mermaid. Everyone remembers that Ariel loved to use his shoes as clothing, right? Well, Solan and D. West has discovered that oyster shells have interesting properties, especially useful for sneakers. That's how they came up with sneakers with soles made from oyster shells. They created it with the help of a 3D printer. Shoes are designed for athletes and custom fit people who have tried them say good things. They're comfy, environmentally friendly, and even a little bit fancy. Taiwan's Olympic team approve since West started talking. About sports, the uniforms of the Taiwanese Olympic team this year were made from high-tech materials, using innovative methods. Actually, there's a lot to say about each item, but I'm most interested in the polo shirts. They're made from 2 types of yarn, biodegradable material and sea wool, which I talked about today. And the materials were chosen not just to showcase the country's industry strengths, but also because it's cooling yarns. So the athletes will stay cool, comfortable, and dry oysters now. If you got to some beaches in Taiwan, you'll see snow, and people aren't. Happy about it's because it's marine debris styrofoam left over from farming activities. You remember, right? Oysters float on rafts supported by foam. White polystyrene buoys used in oyster aquaculture are one of the most common types of trash along the island's western coast, even in Japan. Styrofoam made up 99.5% of all the marine debris collected during the survey of 31 miles of coastline, of course. Taiwan is trying to fight pollution. Moreover, a recent study in South Korea found that styrofoam buoys on which oysters float harm the shellfish themselves. Typhoon versus oysters. At the beginning of August this year, the shores of China and Taiwan were covered with so many oysters that people came to collect them with buckets. Why, well, you've already guessed from the caption, who am I kidding? It's all about the typhoon. It caused nearly $26 million in damage to Taiwan's agriculture sector, with oysters in shallow waters being the #1 victim. 7,760 acres of oyster farms were damaged, and reporters who arrived on the scenes saw that oysters were literally everywhere. Oyster apocalypse, most of the shellfish just died. But I'm curious if this will affect the textile industry. After all, there's suddenly a huge amount of raw material. And you, dear viewer, are with me like right now. See you later.